I hope everyone's well. I hope you're having a great week so far. And in this video, we're going to do an introduction to portrait painting. On the screen now is a completed painting, and this is a simpler one. It's much easier than some of the other lessons I have on this channel. As you can see, it's black and white. In art, we call this a grisaille. Grisaille is a French word meaning grade. So in painting, it's basically a black and white study or painting to understand the values instead of the color. So unlike my other videos, this one is going to be entirely in black and white. That way, it's going to force us to just see values rather than looking at color. For this painting, we're going to keep it as simple as possible. So throughout this whole painting process, we're only going to be using one color. And also this portrait is going to be easier and more forgiving because it's a side profile portrait. For any new painters or airbrush artists, this is going to help you out a lot because you don't have to worry about the symmetry, which could be really challenging when you're looking at a face straight on. If you're going to paint along with me, please feel free to pause the video here to use this as your reference. I'm going to be painting this one on smooth canvas that I created myself. I have a video which I'm linking down below showing you how to make your own. I think smooth canvas is the best surface to airbrush on just because it's very forgiving and it's really easy to erase into. But I understand that setting up your own canvas is time consuming, it's a bit messy, and it's not for everyone. So if you'd like a surface that you could paint directly on that you could buy in the stores, I recommend this Legion Yupo paper. This type of paper is synthetic and it's water resistant, so that means the paint's going to sit on the surface rather than penetrating the fibers like it would on traditional paper. If you use this stuff, you could paint directly on it, but I definitely recommend adding at least one coat of gesso. I like gesso just because it allows you to soft erase into the paint a lot easier. But I think it's best for everyone to kind of just try different materials and surfaces and see what you like best. So with that out of the way, let's get right into this painting. And the first thing we're going to do is mix our color. Color mixing couldn't be easier. Here I'm just using Sepia by Createx Illustration Colors, and then I'm going to dilute it with about 10 to 15% of distilled water. After mixing up the color really well on this paint mixer, what I like to do is add the paint into these small plastic bottles. This way it's just easy to store the paint and really easy to put a few drops into the airbrush. If you mix your own paint, which really everyone does, I definitely recommend picking up some of these bottles. It just makes everything so much easier and cleaner because you don't have to worry about mixing it in the airbrush. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a grid. This way we're going to be able to transfer our reference photo over onto our canvas. Now this grid's nice and easy. It's going to be 1 inch by 1 inch. So you can see along the top, I just added a dot every 1 inch, and I'm doing the same along the bottom. From here, all we have to do is connect the lines. We want to do the same thing for the horizontal line mark. So what I'm going to do is just add a dot every 1 inch on the left side of the paper and also on the right side. And just like before, all we're going to do is connect them. And just like that, we have a simple grid, and this is such a great way to learn to transfer any of your images over onto your canvas. Now I'm aware not everyone has a printer, so I got you covered here. What I'm doing right now is placing up an image on the screen. This is the reference photo with the 1x1 grid on it. And just to the right of that, here's the photo reference. So if you want to use this as your guide to help you paint, please feel free to. Moving over to my canvas, I'm going to enlarge this image. So I'm going to set up a grid of 1.5 inches. This is very simple to set up. All we want to do is place a marker every 1.5 inches. We're doing the same thing we did on the reference photo, only this time the grid sizes are a little bit larger. After dots are placed every 1.5 inch on the left and right side, all we're going to do is connect the lines. While doing this yourself, I recommend using a very light graphite pencil, like a 4H or a 6H. Here in this video, I'm using an HB so that it shows up and then you guys can see it. But if I did it myself, the lines would be incredibly light so I could erase them out before I go into the painting. And just like before, what we're going to do is place a dot every 1.5 inches on the top and bottom and then connect them. From here, we're able to transfer over our drawing, and I think grids is really one of the best ways to learn drawing and to really understand proportions and perspective. If you struggled with drawing in the past, make sure you try to use some grids to help you out. I know it takes some time to set up, it takes about 10-15 minutes each time, but I promise you it's going to help you improve your drawing. I'm placing numbers and letters up along the columns and rows. You don't need to do this in your real drawing, but I think it'll just make it easier to see what I'm doing in the video. What I like to do is start with the top of the drawing and work my way down. And while I'm doing this, I'm just constantly looking over at my reference and I'm comparing the grids, making sure everything lines up. When you're using a grid to help you draw, what you're doing is you're simplifying the image and basically breaking it down into a bunch of very small drawings rather than one large one. This is not a difficult thing to master. It may be a bit confusing the first time you work on it, but you'll get used to it maybe after the fourth or fifth time of practicing these. And what's going to happen is it's really going to help you improve your overall drawing skills. And if you do this for a while, let's say a year or two, what's going to happen is you're really not even going to need the grids anymore. Your brain is kind of understand what you're seeing and then how to translate that using a graphite pencil onto your canvas. But of course, for me, grids are always good because it gives you the confidence to know that everything is lined up in the right places and the proportions are correct, so that when you go on to do the actual paintings, you don't have to doubt yourself or worry that maybe something's off. Once I'm finished mapping in all my outlines and my contour drawings, what I like to do is use some 4012 reducer that's made by Createx and just place it on a shop cloth and lightly clean off any of the lines. This will clean it down to blank canvas so the grid lines completely disappear. Remember that I'm using an HB pencil here, which is darker, so that you guys can see what I'm doing on video. When I do this myself, I always use a lighter pencil like a 4H or a 6H. That way to remove the lines using some reducer and a shop cloth, it's just so much easier. They basically erase off instantly. You could even use some just normal traditional erasers. And then once I have all my grid lines removed, I just come back in with a pencil and just go over my drawing to clean it up. When you do this yourself, just make sure you use a lighter pencil, because you can see here an HB is just too dark and it's difficult to clean up. So now that we have all our lines mapped in, we're ready to start painting. So here I'm using an Iwata Custom Micron and I'm spraying at 20 psi. You don't need any sort of expensive or fancy airbrush for this. Any one you have will work just fine. Just make sure that it's a double action. Of course, the color that we're using here is the same one that we mixed in the beginning of the video. It's Sepia by Createx Illustration Colors, thinned down with some distilled water. This color is transparent, so we're going to be adjusting all our values by how much paint we lay down. So generally, I like to start with the eyes. What I'm doing here is starting with the upper eyelid, and if we look at the reference photo, you'll see that there's a very dark cast shadow on the left side of it. Now, a lot of the lines around this eyelid kind of have a bumpy or organic edge to it. So what I like to do is just take a normal piece of copy paper and rip it. When you rip it like that, you get a nice texture to the edge of it. It almost looks like an organic edge. While painting, I like different edges and different textures, so I always switch off between painting freehand and also using some sort of shield. So when using any sort of shield, including this ripped piece of paper, what I like to do is spray basically on the paper and let the overspray from the airbrush kind of just drift onto the canvas. This way you're going to get very soft, subtle lines. If you spray the paint onto the canvas rather than onto the paper, the line generally just comes out too dark and it's difficult to adjust, because later we may have to erase into it or clean it up. So when you're using a shield, always try to spray on the shield itself, because the nice thing about an airbrush is that we always get overspray with it, so we have to use that overspray to our advantage in some cases. You'll see throughout this video that I'm using a bunch of different shields. I'm going to have a link down below to a video I made all about different shields and ones that you can make yourself. So once I have these sharper outlines defined around this upper eyelid, I'm just going to come in freehand and start filling in this area. You can see in the reference here that this is very dark, so we're just going to have to add more and more paint, but we have to do this slowly. We can't rush. You never want to add too much paint right away with an airbrush, because if you do, it starts to get messy. The paint could start dripping. So what I like to do is just build it up in small layers, and I let each layer dry for about 10-15 seconds before going on to the next one. That's one of the main reasons why I love using an airbrush and acrylic paint, because acrylic paint just dries so quickly that we could add layers in seconds. If we were using oil paint, we'd have to wait at least a day, 24 hours or so before coming in to add a second layer. So this is a nice way to just speed up the whole painting process. Now I'm going back to my ripped piece of paper here just to lightly spray in the edge of this lower eyelid. And just like before, I'm just spraying on the paper, not on the canvas, letting that overspray do the work for me. As you saw in the beginning of the video, the lighting in the reference photo is very dramatic. So a lot of the features are going to be hidden in shadow. And this is, again, one of the reasons that this portrait is going to be easier than some of the other ones that I've worked on this channel. So working on the eye here, I used that ripped piece of paper just to define that lower eyelid and basically where that dark shadow is going to be underneath the upper eyelid. Once those outlines or contours are marked in, we could just switch over to freehand and start filling in that area. So at this point, we have the basic shapes of the eye mapped in, right? We have the upper eyelid and we have the area down below where the iris is kind of mapped in a cast shadow. And we're going to use the values in here and the shapes mapped in to kind of guide us as we work our way up to the eyebrow. Just above the eye, I'm adding some skin texture using the template that I made myself. If you want to make your own, the link for that is of course down below. There's a transition of value for the bridge of the nose just above the eye that's very soft, so I'm just painting this in freehand. Remember that when you paint freehand, you're always going to get very soft lines because an airbrush is atomizing the paint. As you can see in the reference on the right side of this upper eyelid, we have some highlights. So I'm switching over to an eraser and I'm going to start erasing out these highlights. While I'm doing this, I'm just erasing like I would with a normal pencil eraser, but I'm trying to erase in small circular motions. As you do this, what's happening is you're lifting up the paint. You're basically removing it. And I've noticed that sepia by Createx Illustration erases very easily. It's much easier to erase than black. So that's one of the reasons that I decided to use sepia for this whole painting. The eraser I'm using is made by Staedtler and it's called a Mars Razor. And it's just a little bit more aggressive than a traditional pink or white soft pencil eraser. These are usually sold or marketed as ink erasers or sand erasers because they're just one step more aggressive than a normal pencil eraser. If you use a normal eraser, you're going to find that it's extremely difficult to remove the paint. So make sure you pick one of these up. While you're erasing, always make sure that you're looking back at the reference. The reference photo is going to tell you where all the highlights are. And the good news is the more that you paint or the more that you draw, your observation skills are going to improve along with that, and you'll just get better and better with each painting. While working on any painting, your observation skills are always being challenged and exercised. So there's no sort of training or exercise to improve this. The more you paint, the better you'll get, because what's going to happen is, like me, you're going to make plenty of mistakes along the way, and each one of those mistakes is going to teach you and help you to improve. Mistakes are always a good thing in painting. I know they're frustrating and annoying, but they just teach you to get better and better. So moving along to some of these wrinkles underneath the eye, we could see that in the reference photo, these are kind of exaggerated because the light's so dramatic. But what I'm doing here is just using that shield to lightly spray in these lines. When using any sort of shield, you're basically just trying to map in the lines or the transition from where one value starts and one value ends. So once those lines are mapped in, I always switch over to freehand and then kind of just spray over them to darken the values up where I need to. While I'm painting, I'm always thinking that once I add some paint down, I'm going to switch back over to an eraser to pull out highlights. So if you spray too dark or you lay too much paint on there, it's just much more difficult to erase. So try to keep those values nice and light. When using an airbrush, it's always so much easier to darken any values than it is to lighten them, because lightening them, you either have to use an opaque, lighter paint over the top, or you have to erase into them, and that's always a lot more work. So just remember, the lighter you are with your paint, the better. You could always darken it up later down the road. Now, before we go any further with the eye, what I want to do is start mapping in the contours of the forehead and the nose. So the way I'm going to do this is use this large shield and lay it on the line that separates the forehead from the background. All I do is lay it flat along that line and then just lightly spray a small amount of paint just to give me a very subtle line. I'll come in later and darken this up. Regardless of what type of shield you use for this, you'll see that the shield never lines up perfectly with your outline because every single outline is going to be slightly different. So the way you go about this is you just place the shield on one section of the curve and spray it, and then move down to the next section. So you're just slowly working your way down each curve. Using a small amount of paint is really important when you do this because you can kind of blend each area where you start and stop the curve. So just above the eye where the eyebrow is, I'm just spraying in a bunch of small lines to give the impression that there's some hair there. Now, anyone new to airbrushing may find it difficult to control small thin lines like this, so if you'd like, you could just use a black colored pencil and that'll work just as well. Underneath the eye where these wrinkles are, we could see that they're just too light in comparison to the reference photo. So what I want to do is just freehand spray over them to give me a transition on each one from dark to light. This transition of value is going to make them look more 3D because the darker area is going to look like it's in shadow and the brighter area is going to look like it's in highlight and closer to us. We were able to put in these lines earlier using a shield, so now we could just go in freehand on top of them and adjust the values to make them look more accurate to the final painting. And from here, what we're going to do is switch over to an eraser and start pulling out highlights. Each one of these shadows that we put in has a highlight above it, so I'm just erasing out a small amount of paint above each line. You just want to make sure when you're erasing that you don't press too hard, because if you press really hard on the eraser, it's going to pull out all the paint and it's going to be a very bright highlight. So on this canvas, you could just adjust how much paint you pull out by how much pressure you use. And like I said before, for some of these very small lines like the eyelashes, I'm using a black colored pencil here. This is a very thin, made by Prismacolor, and it's perfect to get in and define any dark shadows. I know with any airbrush, including a micron, it's always a challenge to spray in small thin lines that start and stop in a very short distance. So if you can make it easy on yourself, go for it. And the best way to do that is a colored pencil. You can see here that the eyelashes are casting these two very soft shadows off to the left of the eye. So I'm using a piece of paper as a shield to spray these in. They need to be light and subdued, so the way to do that is just spray a small amount of paint. Besides using a normal stick eraser, you could also use an electric eraser to pull out some of your highlights. And I like this because you can pull out very small little dots if you just tap it across the surface. As you can see here below the eye, just on the bridge of the nose here, I'm switching over to an electric eraser. Now, any type of electric eraser will work well for this because they generally have enough power in them to remove the paint. As long as the surface is very smooth, so if you're using that synthetic paper that I recommended in the beginning of this video, or even better, a very smooth canvas, you'll notice that any sort of electric eraser will be able to remove the paint. So now for the last part to finish up this video, what we're going to start doing is spraying in some of the flesh tone. So the way I like to do this is hold my airbrush pretty far away, about 6 to 10 inches, and then just spray the smallest amount of paint. You can see here on the right side of the forehead, I'm spraying a very thin dusting from the eye up to the top of the forehead. Since the background of this painting is going to be black, you don't have to worry about any overspray getting on there, so you could just do this freehand. For anyone brand new to using an airbrush, you may find this part difficult because you're really spraying on the smallest amount of paint. I really can't exaggerate that enough. And the first time you do this, it's just so easy to spray too much paint. So one of the ways to get around this is to just try to hold the airbrush farther back than you may think. If you're holding it 8 inches back and you feel like it's spraying too much, try even going farther back. Go back a foot and see what sort of texture you get. The farther back you are from the surface of the canvas, the softer of a transition you're going to get because the paint is taking farther to travel from the airbrush to that canvas. And while I'm doing this, it's also important to point out that I'm pulling back on my trigger the smallest amount possible, basically like a 1/4 or a 1/2 millimeter back, just enough so I see some of that paint being atomized and laying onto the canvas. If you struggle with this part, don't worry about it. Don't give up. Just keep practicing. You could even try just spraying on a blank piece of paper, see if you can get a very soft transition. The more you paint, the more you're going to build up muscle memory, and you'll understand how far to pull back and how far away the airbrush should be from the surface to give you the right value that you're looking for. So that's where we're going to wrap up the first part of this video. Next week, we're going to go into the stuff that you're seeing right now. We're going to start with the rest of the forehead and work on the hair. And then from there, we're just going to slowly work our way down the rest of the portrait. And I'm going to go into all the detail that you need to know to paint the ear, the nose, and the mouth. So that's going to complete this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you come back early next week for the second and final part of this video. And just remember, don't worry about making those mistakes. I promise anyone could paint like this. This is not a difficult portrait. It's just going to take some time for you to kind of understand how the airbrush applies paint to the canvas, and also how to improve your skills and observation. So just keep working on your paintings and don't give up. I'll see you next week.